Today, we're going to talk a little bit more, because it's always ever-present topic, about trauma and its discontents, with a focus on the Holocaust. Maybe you're wondering how we're going to get to the Holocaust, but you'll see. I can begin by mentioning I've met Gabor Mate, and I heard his origin story, and this is his origin story. He himself didn't experience the Holocaust, but his parents escaped Hungary while he was pregnant. And he reckons that his trauma was the anxiety that he experienced through his mother in utero. And that caused him to be addicted, which took the form of addiction to classical music and to compulsively purchasing compact discs. Now, okay, that's a way of understanding your experience. And I think it's useful for people to identify addiction in their own lives. Gabor became famous because he was the medical director for the Portland Hotel Services. That clientele was very traumatized. They were homeless and mentally ill. They had been abused multiple ways growing up. And Gabor told their story and treated them. God bless him. It does seem slightly out of context to describe him as traumatized compared with them. Mm-hmm. And that's a dilemma that I face in my own life. I sometimes deal with people or clients. I only had one sibling and he committed suicide. And sometimes I've told people that. I don't tend to, for a number of reasons. One reason is, I'm so privileged. I went to the University of Pennsylvania and I was in the honor program. I went on a full boat. I went to graduate school at the University of Michigan on another full boat. And I taught at the Harvard Business School, and I was the youngest person to teach there since Robert McNamara, who became head of the Defense Department and was head of the Ford Motor Company. So for me to describe myself as traumatized seems inauthentic. But let's leave that where it is. I know people who actually experienced the Holocaust. Now, I didn't know them growing up in Philadelphia. My parents were born in the US, and my mother's grandparents were born in Ukraine, and they all came around 1915, before the First World War. So I didn't know Holocaust victims. Later in life, I found more of them in New York City. They ended up in New York City, and they would sometimes have, tattooed concentration camp stamps on their arms. So I've met more Holocaust experienced people after my youth. This is all by way of describing, yes, a couple of days ago, I went to get a heart stress test. And I was aware that the guy who was going to be partly giving it to me, two guys were going to give it to me, had a French name. So I imagined, some French guy. This is New York City. A lot of medical and technical people are coming here from all over the world. And then I saw kind of a little New Yorker guy. And I said, "You're French?" And he said, "Yeah." And I said, "Where were you born?" He said, "Cannes." And I said, "Oh, wow." And then I said, "Are you Jewish?" And he said, "Yes." And then I said, "When did you leave France?" And he said, 1946. When I was 8. And I said, "You lived in France, Nazi-occupied France, as a Jewish person during World War II?" And he said, "Yes, my aunt took me to some kind of Pyrenees village or something in the middle of the country. And I was out of the way," although you always had to be aware of people turning you in. And then I said, what about your parents? And he said, oh, my parents were part of the resistance. They were captured and they were sent to concentration camps. My mother went to Auschwitz. And both my mother and my father survived, and my father wrote a memoir. And I said, huh.
It's like impossible. I'd like that you don't expect to meet somebody with that kind of a backstory. Sorry.
In 19 and 20,
right.
21.
Right. Certainly not now. Yeah.
And then I started doing the age thing. I said, how old are you? And he refused to tell me. But he looked like a regular, we're at some high price, some big New York hospital. And the guy's doing this techno thing on my breathing and all. And I said, don't they make you retire at some age or anything? And he said something like, I like to work. And I thought, God bless, he doesn't want to sit home in his, I hope I don't give too much away. He's lived in the village his entire time in the US. So he has a whole village story about how the village has changed. So I'm thinking, I made a bad joke. And here's the bad joke I made. You were traumatized, but you were too busy surviving to realize that you were traumatized. He doesn't say, oh, woe is me. My parents were in a concentration camp and I was scared as a 5-year-old that some Nazi collaborator was. He doesn't talk about that. He talks about living in the village. He talks about his life. And by the way, just to give me credit, I would think not everybody who comes in for a stress test gets a guy's whole life story. You know
right.
what I mean?
Right. You do have a way. I can see the guy who never tells a story, but did tell it to you that day.
And it's because I'm tuned into anomalies. This guy's a French name and he's got a New York accent. So let me move on to another person. I have a good friend. He's also a good friend of Ethan Nadelman's, who had a very similar story set in the Netherlands. His name is Peter Cohen. And I've known Peter a long, long time. I've stayed at his place in Amsterdam, and he's visited and stayed in my place in New York. And in fact, in 1994, he was the person who introduced me when I won a career scholarship award from the Drug Policy Foundation. It was 1994, and Ethan made that happen. And Peter introduced me. And over the decades, we visited back and forth. And a few years ago, he bought a house or built a house on the coastline of France, and I went and stayed with him for a while. And he's still around. And Peter's a kind of an ornery character. Maybe that's why we get along. And he's older than me. I was born in 46. But he's still kicking and screaming and as ornery as ever. And, we exchange emails and he is cutting up this or cutting up that. We've never discussed him being a trauma victim. That's never crossed his lips. He's just lived the life. Oh, he was a famous drugs epidemiology researcher. Ethan tuned into him because at the University of Amsterdam, he started tracking drug use. And what he noticed is that a lot of people use drugs and most of them don't have problems. That was his shtick. And so, I'm thinking in my later life as an adult, I've started to run into people who've actually experienced the Holocaust. Now, I'm Jewish. I don't have daydreams that I would have survived the Holocaust or had anything good to say about. I'm not saying that. But naturally, I'm stunned to meet normal human beings in my natural course of life who've endured the Holocaust. Although the two people I've just described didn't actually end up in concentration camps, depending on how you consider trauma, they've been through things you and I can't imagine.
So you have a connection. You've got Gabor who says something happened to me in utero. You know, my mother was stressed. Of course, what else would she be but incredibly stressed? And you could call what she went through traumatic. Absolutely. And because he got these chemicals rushing to his brain, well, it was fashioned in such a way that when he grew up, he can trace his own addiction to buying CDs or records back to this thing that happened in utero. Just he's traumatized by proxy. And you're saying, you know, two people who have undergone, actually been the Gabor's mother in this situation, and they have nothing that would be trace backable to the traumatic event. In fact, their traumas.
As far as I know, Gabor's mother got out before the Nazis got in. That's my impression. Go on.
I think he did write about that in what is his book called? Ghosts. You're right. I think she was out before, but it was the, and so you'd say if anyone had the hierarchy of trauma, it'd be the two people you just mentioned, and those people, it did not connect directly that there's some, you know, impairment in their life, and certainly if there were any, which we all have at some time, they're not tracing it back to their own trauma.
And they're two guys who were in their 80s who've had long, successful lives. Mm-hmm. And when I told it to the guy, I'll say his name was Claude, it wasn't. I said, oh, you were traumatized. He just laughed. In other words, he doesn't conceive of his life in that fashion.
Right.
And, you know, you're allowed to conceive of your life in that fashion if you want to. And the question is, what are the consequences? And are they helpful or not?
Mm-hmm. Like if Gabor was one of our clients and we didn't know anything about his, you know, he didn't know he was a best-selling author or doctor or something, we would accept his narrative coming in. We wouldn't say, no, you idiot.
I mean, Gabor is a physician, right, and a world-famous author. Mm-hmm. There are gradations of trauma and there are gradations of addiction. We deal with that in the Life Process program. You know, it's useful to think of things as being addictive, and maybe buying CDs compulsively. He'll describe how he went out when he had other obligations. To do that is useful. But there are people whose lives are up in flames and wrecked completely. And so being aware of that gradient is critical. Like being aware of the gradient of trauma is critical. And the consequences, possibly negative, of conceiving of your life in that way. And there's some people cannot not conceive of it. The Portland Hotel Services clientele is a group of people whose lives they were sexually and physically abused and had manifestations of mental illness and never had a normal life, are in one category where you cannot avoid being aware of it, but then extending that to the realm of people like me and Gabor, perhaps. My brother committed suicide. My father was highly volatile. I wasn't hit or anything like that. You know, I had a stable background, but you really had getting back to how I could read Claude. I'm a hypervigilant person because my father had these erratic emotional moods. I'm constantly aware of people and what they're feeling and what they're saying and how those match up. I'm never not tuned in to where human beings are coming from. And I don't, you know, that's my response perhaps to trauma, but it's kind of, my whole life is built on that. I mean, I started thinking about addiction, thinking about people in that fashion. And I developed the Life Process program as a way of helping people become more conscious of who they are and how they're behaving and what the roots of that are. Which you might say I'm encouraging people to be aware of trauma, but I'm trying to normalize mindfulness.
Right.
To make it a normal.
Well put. Sorry, they were very well put. I like that.
And so I have some similar concerns to Gabor, and I'm very aware of people's backgrounds and where they're coming from and how that affects who they are now.
Yeah.
But I put a whole different emphasis on it from Gabor.
This is Gabor's classic line to you. I could think of a million responses you could give, but I even think I read in an article he was pressed about, hey, what about the thing about Peele and his writing about you? And he said, well, Peele wants to attack me because he thinks I'm saying that everyone who's traumatized becomes addicted. And I don't think that. I just think everyone who is addicted has been traumatized.
And people who, what's the right word? Respect, kiss up to Gabor, don't believe that. I mean, Bruce Alexander and Andrew Tatarsky, who has them come in to speak in New York, and Bruce is a mutual friend of acquaintance of mine. And both of them say, well, that's just not true. That you can say, well, everybody who's addicted had some kind of trauma. I mean, well, you cite yourself, you're a fairly privileged guy. Nothing especially stands out trauma-wise, and you managed to become addicted for a period in your life.
Yeah. Yep.
And of course, the thing that we most dislike about the trauma model is it's a permanent disease model. It's Gabor and I agree that genetics don't explain it, but he then says, but these experiences, even in utero, completely change your brain in a way that can never be eradicated. That's not a useful way of thinking. I don't think Peter Cohen and Claude would have been helped if somebody sat them down and explained, oh my God,
right, what
you've been through is so impossible and incomprehensible. So I just want to bridge this to one last thing. There's a cell phone company that's going around in the United States funding school. They figured out the best way to be Trump-like MAGA people and to change values is to impact school board composition. And in the suburbs of Fort Worth, Texas, they've taken control of 4 school boards. And one of the things that they do when they take control is to eliminate books from the library.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the books that they've eliminated is what do they call it? A visual version of Anne Frank's diary.
The graphic novel of Anne Frank's.
Graphic novel. Now, I've recently, there's been a lot revealed about Anne Frank, the part that wasn't in her diary, how she and Anne Frank and her family were holed up in the back of a building, they're Jews, in Amsterdam, and they interacted with a lot of people, fair-down people who knew where they were, and she wrote about her feelings on a daily basis. She was a young teenager, 13 through 15. She interacted with people, and she had her desires and her yearning and her aspirations and her, ruminations on the world, all while living in a kind of a hidden attic in one building. She was undergoing trauma. It's a real life experience of trauma. And you can't read her diary and think she's traumatized. She's like an expiring, alive, energized human being. Somebody betrays them, and there's a whole literature now about who betrayed them.
Mm-hmm.
She was sent to Belsen, where she died of a fever. So doesn't have a happy ending. And her mother died at Auschwitz. Her father survived, and he amended her diary because some of it was too personal and had sexual and interpersonal things in it. It was too alive. And people have gone back and said, well, why don't we put down what she actually wrote? We're a little better able to deal with some of those things now. And so the stunning thing to me is, uh, I don't want to make her, she's a hero, she's a heroine. Her fate is something to really despise. But she overcame it to write something that's life-giving, was life-giving at the time, and has continued to be life-giving into the future. And now they want to remove a version of it from the library. I imagine if I were at the school board meeting, I'd get up and say, well, are you thinking of bringing back the Holocaust? And then they would start cutting me up and all something like that. And then I would say, oh, are you thinking of sending me to a concentration camp? So these are just the kinds of things I fantasize about. So, one of the things I like to do is to ask you completely imponderable questions that require you to read my mind.
Okay. Yeah, you do like to do that. I'm ready.
Why does the Holocaust make me feel want to legalize drugs and to welcome alcohol into the world?
You could say Holocaust in pretty much any conversation to mean like the worst circumstances you could possibly be facing. Would it be unhealthy, or could it be productive in some way to use a mind-altering substance during the worst circumstance a human being could possibly face? And some people face the worst circumstances, certainly from their own perspectives. And sometimes people get through those circumstances because by their own ages. So
some of them use drugs and
right.
drink.
Some of them using drugs to get by that period of time. Yeah.
Very good. Here's how I think about it. I mean, you can say all the terrible things in the Holocaust, and I can imagine being Jewish living under that. But the thing that presses on my mind is Hitler and his coterie of Nazis and a good part of the whole country said, why don't we eliminate a whole race of people?
Mm-hmm.
Whatever Jews are. And I think, how do you get that idea?
Mm-hmm.
That's like, and I'm not religious. I don't say, oh, God created Jews.
I see where you're going.
I'm saying, here's a bunch of people, and somebody decides, well, why don't we eliminate them from the face of the earth?
Mm.
In the early 1990s, the World Health Organization hit a real nadir. They appointed a guy to be head of international drug control, and this was his plan: to eliminate all coca-producing plants, all marijuana-producing plants, and all opium-producing poppies on the face of the earth. That was the plan. That was the plan. Now, he only had that job for a couple of years, and the fact that WHO appointed him is a burden they'll have to bear for the rest of their lives. Well, it's WHO a life. What kind of a delusional person has that kind of a plan? Right. But let me take one step further back. All that is an argument for why drugs need to be accepted and alcohol need to be accepted in our lives. I mean, the coca plants and marijuana and poppies, they just grow.
They're there. They're ubiquitous.
They're everywhere. People have been using them, all of them, since antiquity. And they've come more or less to grips with them. They found uses for them, obviously, morphine and painkillers. Mm-hmm. And so who has the idea, like that demented guy, why don't we eliminate this thing from all of our lives? And of course, that brings up alcohol, which was eliminated legally in the United States from 1920 to 1933, and which some people keep pushing in the same direction to say it's a completely unsafe substance. Alcohol has been found at the well sources of every piece of human existence. Wine ferments into alcohol. They didn't have refrigeration in the Middle East or ice. In a matter of half an hour, grapes become alcohol. And there's histories of farming, very thought through histories about agriculture that say all civilization is created when human beings stopped being hunter-gatherers and they started planting crops. And one of the main reasons they planted crops was to create beer. And beer is created, you don't have to do a ton. If a wheat type grain becomes wet and then is exposed to heat, it alcoholizes. And distillation isn't a ton more complicated. And so there's a certain class of anthropologists who explore all of that. And when I read that, I say, alcohol is and some people say this, the ethanol molecule has grown up alongside human civilization. They're part of the same bonded eon, or whatever, atomic particle you speak of. Why would we think, oh, you know what, this is our enemy, this is alien? And where that comes up, getting back to the Jewish theme, I was once interviewed by somebody. We've written a book called Outgrowing Addiction. I wrote something called Addiction Proof Your Child. And they actually interviewed me on CNN with my daughter, Anna. And we were having a meal with wine. And it wasn't 21 then. And when they had me on CNN to interview me, they had a big pile of whiskey and scotch bottles. And the producer came and removed them. That's one of the few times in my life where somebody really came in to rescue me. And the interviewer, when I talked about, what about the Last Supper and Catholics drinking wine? And Last Supper was a Passover dinner where Jews give wine to every member at the table. A 4-year-old, they'll just mix the water with wine. And the woman was Jewish, and she said, that wasn't wine, that was grape juice. My conception of being Jewish is we don't have a church in the excommunication thing. Anybody who believes that should be excommunicated. That's, to me, they're not.
Who actually believes that, yeah, right.
So, today we talked about trauma, the Holocaust, Judaism, natural resilience in the face of adversity, and why all of this can give us a different slant on psychoactive substances.
And we did it all in under half an hour. Cheers to you, Stanton.
Cheers to you, and thanks for all your help as always, Zach. Toodaloo.